Hello and welcome to our 35th edition of FSI Fridays. I'm Edwin, live in Boston, joined by
Johansson, live in Charlotte.
Hey Johansson, happy Friday. What do we have lined up today?
Thanks, Edwin, and those joining us today. We're going to talk about what's top of mind for insurance organizations today and the significant importance of risk modeling.
Next, we'll hear about the framework around the risk compute process and how AI is extremely beneficial.
And then last, we'll talk about the approach, best practices, and hear about an insurance organization that has undergone this transformation.
Then we'll wrap it up with Q&A.
Today on FSI Fridays.
For those of you watching live or on YouTube, as a quick reminder, we'll spend around 30 minutes on today's topic and leave the last 10-15 minutes to address any burning questions.
So please use the Q&A window and we'll monitor for questions during the presentation. If you're watching the recording, feel free to use the comments below to ask your questions.
So let's get started today. Meet the presenter. Johansson, who's our special guest this week?
Thanks, Edwin. We're thrilled to be joined by Brian Cartwright, an industry executive for U.S. Financial Services. Brian, can you share with the audience your role at Microsoft and what your typical day is like? We also heard that your fun fact is opposite of one of our guests from last week.
Hi, guys, and happy Friday. I'm actually an industry executive in the U.S. Financial Services, focusing on insurance. My job is to work with customers and different teams at Microsoft to help them modernize and enable new capabilities to create insurance solutions. One of my focus points is improving risk modeling. I live in New Jersey, and I'm really glad that it's springtime because I get to start riding my bike again, because working at home all this time, my office is just a little too close to my fridge.
Well, that's awesome. You're making me hungry now, Brian. And by the way, Kelly from NASDAQ, if you're listening, maybe Brian can give you some bike riding lessons. So let's get right into it, Brian. What's going on in the insurance industry? You know, there's a lot of volatility this past year. What are insurers really worried about today? And what is risk modeling? Why is risk modeling important? Modernization and transformation has been a huge topic of our past episodes. So can you speak to those topics?
Yeah, so from an industry look, transformation is really going to be needed here in the risk modeling environment. So when you take a look at some of the impacts that are impacting the industry, when you look at claims, the frequency and severity of them is increasing. Switching economy, you know, right now there's a lot of competition between insurance companies, so customers are willing to switch. So they're always looking for a better customer experience. And you're really trying to, insurers are really trying to get that loyalty going with their customers. Market volatility, this is really big lately, in my eyes at least, because the market volatility, if you take a look at what's going on because of the pandemic, some of the political activity that's going on in the country, the markets go up and down. That's something that when companies have products that are impacted by the market volatility, they swing up and down, and the companies really need to be careful around those. And then the other aspect around the economy on insurance companies too is low interest rates. Low interest rates, companies aren't able to make the interest on some of their investments and how they make money on premiums that are brought in because of the low interest rates. And it's hard to get that baseline in there. So they have to do other things to really work around the low interest rates.
Brian, I see that there's burden of legacy here. And I know from working with our insurance customers today that there is a lot of legacy, a lot of old data centers. And there's this need to kind of be faster and more agile and more quicker. I'm sure this burden of legacy is one of the key drivers to improving resiliency, but also improving speed and scale.
That is a big challenge for a lot of companies today. Some companies that have been around for a while have these large legacy environments and systems that really make it harder for them to move forward fast. And then that kind of leads into some of the other things that I have on the bottom here too. When you talk about the regulatory environment, there's always new regulatory changes, which are really causing a lot of change in the way that companies have to meet those regulatory requirements. Sorry. You know, things like IFRS and LDTI are driving companies to rethink the way they're actually doing their risk modeling processes, because they're really involved and really are adding a lot of complexity and amount of runtime needed to get the results they need. And when you have that burden and legacy, you always have to think about some of the fintech innovators and the non-traditional competitors that don't have that legacy, so they can move faster because they're just starting up with their environments on the cloud where they can move faster and innovate faster without having to go backwards to bring other things along with them on their journey.
Thanks, Brian. When we think about risk modeling, many of our audience might think it's a complex process. So let's lay the groundwork here, the framework. Can you share with us typically how this would work and what are some of the concerns?
So if you take a look at this process, this is a really sky-high view of the risk compute process, and I'll walk you through it here. When you start on the left, to start feeding into the process, you have the company, data, and publicly available information, which is usually data from your policy admins, your asset data that you might have in your company, scenarios, different scenarios that you run all your calculations on. So as you enter the process, you have an ingest environment where you collect all of this data, and you really need to master that data and organize it and standardize it so that you have a way to feed your models consistently and create those model input feeds from all that admin data. The next step is your model execution. This is where you actually run a risk model, and typically that's run on a big supercomputing grid, which can literally have thousands of compute cores running your calculation. You do that so that you can actually speed up the execution time of that calculation. Automation here is really important. Most people run their calculations on CPUs, but there are some solutions that are running on different hardware like GPUs to actually get these calculations done faster. Results management is the next step, where after you run all these calculations, all the data that goes into these models, you might generate 1,000 records for every one record that's coming in. So managing these results gets really important because the data gets really big. You really need to make sure that you can organize that data and make sure that you can aggregate it, report on it, and create downstream feeds to other systems such as your ledger or other corporate systems that you need to feed. The next step is applying ML and AI. Having all of this data is a very powerful thing to many organizations. So to do that, to utilize that better, you take the AI and ML and you can apply it against all this data to help gain different insights and make better decisions. Some of the things you can bring in here are like market data, geopolitical data, weather data. All these things can be applied to some of these results to actually update, get more real-time information, and make better decisions. The last part of this, though, that's in the box here is around model management and governance around the environment, right? So model management is talking about your models, the versions, every time you change the models, the assumption that goes in them. It's really important to have tight controls on these things so that you know what you're running, when you're running, so you can make sure that you can go back in time, rerun for audit, regulatory, or other purposes, or sometimes just do an analysis on where things are happening. It's really important to have that all organized.
Brian, thanks for, describing, that data ingestion over all the way to the results management piece. Once you have these results and you apply AI, how can this be beneficial? And, can this apply to other insurance models as well?
So first of all, it's really important to recognize that the results that come out of the models, out of that model execution stage, can actually become inputs to feed other models and loop back through again. But the other aspect is, now that you have all of this data in your results, you can start making AI models, which is a different type of model than your traditional type of model. But this is where you can get new results, new insights from this data. A few additional points to make here is that as you're looking at these data, at these data environments, you see the data ingest and the results. Logically, you usually keep those separate, right? Or when you develop it, you'll keep them separate because it's going to be easier to manage that way. It doesn't mean you can never link them, but you really want to develop them as independent pieces. Data lineage is always going to be important so that you can follow your process through and make sure that you're not dropping records and you have a good audit control throughout your process. You want to design this environment to evolve So this is a really big environment, right? The data environments here are huge. The execution for the models is huge, thousands of cores, like I said before. The data is in terabytes or petabytes. So you really want to make sure you can evolve it, because you don't want to have to rewrite all of this again. And you want to leverage the AI for your new insights. Now, just to reiterate, this pattern is similar no matter what kind of risk calculation that you're doing. You're typically going to have your data come in, calculate, and go out, whether it's a life or a P&C or whatever type of risk calculation that you're running. You're going to find this type of pattern.
Thanks, Brian. So you've got the word compute on this slide in terms of risk compute. When you think about traditional insurance carriers today, to process data through these models requires a lot of compute. And a lot of times there are a lot of complexities being able to scale your data sets and even scale the computing power to execute on this in a timely manner. So there is a lot of risk of time sensitivity. So how do our insurance organizations help address the scale and speed needed to get these calculations done?
So if you take a look at this slide, this really talks about that whole progression of how people deal with this massively parallel compute need that they need to execute these risk calculations. A lot of companies typically start out with an on-premise model, which is on the left, and if you look at this, you take a look at this, and companies start out with this because they have their on-premise infrastructure. And here's the big problem, though, is on-premise, your infrastructure is going to be fixed. So you have these peaks and valleys of when you run. So if you don't size your capacity properly, you either don't have enough capacity at the peaks, or you're buying enough capacity to make your peaks, but then it goes way underutilized the rest of the time. A lot of people start looking at the next stage, which is hybrid, where you have your on-prem compute, but then you start bursting out to the cloud, meaning you run parts of your calculations or some of your calculation processes out in the cloud to take care of those peaks, so that you get much better utilization of your capacity that you already have on-prem. Last stage is fully cloud, which is, in my eyes, really the best way to go. There's always going to be sufficient compute out there in the cloud for you to run. You can scale as much as you want. The setup for running in the cloud is much faster, and it's always available. I've seen times where you need to get an environment put together really quickly, and you can spin this up in the cloud much faster than going out and ordering new hardware, waiting for it to be delivered, racking it, wiring it, configuring it. In the cloud, you can do this in a matter of days rather than weeks or months.
Brian, thanks for walking through those various models. I'm sure our audience is really appreciative that, it's pretty flexible, and especially if those are starting in their cloud journey, right? They can transition all the way to the fully cloud model. So let's make it real for the audience. How do we implement a compute solution to help scale for speed and resources, and what are the different options available?
Okay, so we're still talking about compute here, but there's different ways to get to the compute. So if you take a look at these different options here below, all the way to the left, the hybrid cluster, this is where you have to note that there is that little blue box there called the head node. That is the part of the grid processing that manages all the tasks that run to get the parallel processing done, to get your job done. That's still on-premise, if you notice there. But what it's doing is it's bursting out to the cloud to actually just do the compute on the cloud and bring the results back on-prem. The next one is the cluster on the cloud. This is better because you move the whole job out into the cloud. It executes there, it controls there, and you don't have a lot of thrashing going back and forth between in the cloud and on-prem. It waits till the job is done, and then the results can be ported back on-prem. HPC as a service, so we have what is called Azure Batch. So this really takes your job and packages it up as a service so that you can route your job out into the cloud, run this, and get your results. So the whole thing is managed in the cloud. And then, of course, you need to recognize we have several partners that have hosted solutions out in the cloud that are very mature and very capable of coming up with great solutions. In this case, you bring your own data. and you can send it to them. You can run your models out in their solution, and then you get your results back.
So, Brian, with the ever increasing amount of data, for insurance organizations to unlock the power of this, it's going to require some machine learning and artificial intelligence, or AI, of this data. So, talk to us a little bit about a journey that an insurance customer may have to take, and maybe what are those different stages, or maybe what's the best scenario to kind of aim for if you're an insurance organization listening today?
So, when you take a look at machine learning and AI on a risk, you got to look at where you are on this horizon here. So some companies are on the left-hand side, just trying to really calculate what happened. How do I get to the number that I have now? Where's my current state of the business? But more and more companies are looking to try to get more to the right as they get more mature. They want to move from what happened to understanding why, to predicting what will happen, and then being able to take that action to influence what might have happened differently. So each company is different, but most want to move their capabilities to the right to get more decision-making power out of their AI.
Thanks for that, Brian. In life, I think I'd love to move more to the right and be more proactive and predictive as well. So, what are the Microsoft capabilities as a leader related to machine learning and AI? How far have we come? It's been definitely quite a journey for us as well.
So Microsoft has made some great advances. And here I'm just going to show you a couple of recent charts that have come out from Forrester and Gartner on both the analytics and machine learning from Forrester. You can see where Microsoft rates there, and also on the AI developer services, which is around how Microsoft makes it easier for companies to really integrate their services and come up with solutions easier to adopt AI better in their companies faster. So these are great charts. One's from last fall and one's from just last month from Gartner.
Thanks, Brian, for just really articulating the fact that Microsoft is a leader in this space as it relates to both helping developers build some of these solutions, but also the enhancements from a data and AI perspective. So when we think about our customers' journey to achieving some of this, we talked about the different elements of what would it take and how we would get there. But do you have to move all the data at once? I mean, there's so much data here. Or can they do it in piecemeal? And maybe what's the most important thing for them to understand to get the most out of this and really start to enhance and unlock some of this value?
Great question. So if you take a look at this slide, what you're going to see, this is a typical setup, right? Again, this is a different view of what I presented earlier, but you start on the left with your data center where you have your company data and a lot of the data that feeds your risk process. And a lot of companies start out this way where they have their ingest, their compute, and the results all on-prem and running this way. But if you start to move some of this, right, some companies say, well, I want to start moving my compute, and they'll start to move just the compute first, right? Or if you take a step forward, some companies will say, hey, I have a lot of this running okay, but I'd really like to take advantage of the data environments, the growth that we're dealing with, and some of the AI and ML technology to really make some better decisions. So they might decide they want to start there to get some of the benefits out of migrating this process. Or to some companies, they might have, their problem might be getting all of their data together to feed their models. So that might be where they want to start first. So what you really want to take a look at is, as you move this forward, right, where you want to end up is have this in the cloud. Because here's the thing, right, when you take a look at the growth here and the need to expand for not just the data, the compute, and then the capabilities that the cloud provides with cloud services and AI, that's really where you want to end up. So moving to this order is, moving in whatever order works for you is what's important here. You really want to look at where your priorities are, where you're going to see your benefit and get the most bang for your buck on the startup. But you can move in any order. You definitely want to take advantage of the cloud speed and scale. The data environments, the compute environments, you can scale up to whatever you need to meet those deadlines, to meet those regulatory requirements, financial reporting requirements, or any other kind of risk requirements that you're dealing with. So remember, risk modeling ties into your downstream processes, so you do need to make sure that you're getting those feeds together as you run through the results. Here's some other things to think about, though. Other Azure aspects to leverage would include an easier way to set up your disaster recovery, your backups, your reduced maintenance windows, and compliance reporting. And when I talk about reduced maintenance windows, I think people that support the hardware environments realize that servers need to be taken down on a regular basis to be patched, or security patches applied, or other things done to it. I can also say that I've seen that you can spin up more when you need it also, which is really powerful thing to do, since a lot of this growth is coming and some of it's going to be hard to predict.
Brian, thanks for bringing us through that journey. Again, you're highlighting the flexibility of what's possible. And I think, some of the things that you pointed out is people don't take into account all the maintenance costs and hours that it takes in order to achieve something like this. So we really appreciate you going through that. We talked about a variety of different topics here. Can you really bring it home for the audience and summarize what we've captured?
Sure. Take a look at this, just to recap some of what I've already said here, right? You really want to move these capabilities out to the cloud because there are new capabilities. There's services and there's new technologies that you can take advantage of and really utilize quickly out in the cloud. You have endless expandability for compute and data. And by the way, the other thing is that sometimes I'll give a good example. I was working on an IFRS project at one point, and we needed to actually acquire a bunch of different servers, and people wanted to order a lot of servers on-prem. And we had already migrated a lot of the compute capability into the cloud. And they ended up moving that date out. And had we gone with the initial on-prem thinking of buying that, we would have bought a lot of servers, had that on-prem, and they probably would have been ready for retirement by the time they have to be implemented by the new requirement date. So, taking advantage of that cloud flexibility is really important. Working in the cloud is less costly to maintain, and it's also less costly because you're only paying for what you use, especially on the compute. And it enables those faster results in decision-making processes because of the speed and scale. It's security compliant. When you talk about the cloud, 10 years ago or more, people were worried about security, but really the cloud is really a secure environment, especially in Azure. We have all kinds of help to help people be really comfortable around that and make sure everybody's customers' data stays secure. Upgrades become easier, smaller maintenance windows. I mentioned that before. So you can extend your insights with machine learning and AI. I also spoke of that before. And your disaster recovery is simplified in the cloud.
Thanks, Brian, for really laying out that foundation of, why the benefits of the cloud. But let's make it real a little bit for our audience here. Are there any specific case studies where an insurance organization actually went through this journey around risk?
Sure. Here's a case study. This was done a little while back before I joined Microsoft, where I spent many years leading and building and the support of a large actuarial environment at Met. One thing I knew then and now is that the tech capabilities and demand is always growing and changing, and companies need to build their risk solutions in a way that can continually improve without starting all over. There's always going to be bottlenecks to solve the goal to improve those parts and not disrupt the others.
That's great, Brian. Thanks for sharing that, especially, as MetLife went through this process. What are some of the top recommendations and best practices learned for customers as we think about this journey?
So having lived through this myself, one of the most important things to think about as you're building your process is standardize. There can be multiple risk solutions, but you really want to standardize at least to the high level that I spoke of earlier with your ingestion, compute, and results. But the more you can standardize that process, the more you can do, and the more needs you can address, because it's not a special effort every time you add something in. Standardization is really important. automate, 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 right? You're not going to get any faster if you have a lot of manual steps in between. You really want to automate all your steps as much as possible. You can get more done and you can get to your results faster. Loosely coupled environments is something I feel pretty strongly about. And I spoke about this earlier, where you want to be able to move the component environment forward, but you want to have them kind of loosely coupled so that everything isn't so tied to a technology, because as everybody knows, this technology is evolving really quickly, and there's always going to be new technical capabilities that people are going to want to take advantage of. You don't want to have it so that you have to take the whole environment down to add in a new technology. So the more you can loosely couple the functionality between the handoffs of the systems, the better, because then you can take advantage of the new technologies faster. Plan for growth. I've been doing this for a lot of years. This space always grows. There's always more compute. There's always more data. Whatever you think you have, it's going to be more. So just plan for it. When you plan your environments, consider your ad hoc and research and development needs. A lot of times, the development and ad hoc analysis around some of these risk results is as much as what you might run for production. And there's a lot of research that goes on into developing a model. So make sure you have enough capacity and enough in your planning to handle those types of needs. Have a deployment plan and path defined. There's a lot of components here, and you don't want to change one end of it without the end of it not realizing that something changed. It'll cause you problems. Governance. So one of the things about governance, and I don't mean just the model governance that I spoke of before, but just governance of the environment. This is a huge environment, a lot of capacity, a lot of power, but you want to make sure that you're getting what you want out of it. And sometimes unlimited power can be abused. So you want to make sure you have the right governance about how people access, run, and get and utilize that environment so that you don't waste a lot of power or time on things that are not worth it. Coming down the home stretch here, let us help. Please reach out to your Microsoft team. Let's schedule an Envision session with us today. We can really help you drive some of these solutions forward. And just really don't think about what you're doing now currently. Think about where you want to get to, because that's really where the future is.
No, that's a great recap, Brian. Thanks for sharing your time and perspective. I'm positive our viewers have learned a wealth of information today. So what we learned today is insurance carriers are struggling with demands to optimize their risk modeling operations, gain insights from their data, and address ever-changing regulatory demands.
We also discussed addressing these challenges in the areas of reducing cost and increasing velocity with cloud compute, optimizing your data ingestion process, improving results management, gaining deeper insights with artificial intelligence and machine learning, and more effectively governing your risk models.
And finally, we heard best practices recommendations focused on automation, governance, and pushing the boundaries of the current capabilities to accelerate time to value. So really great stuff. Johansson, let's move to Q&A. What are some of the viewers asking?
Thanks, Edwin. So we've got a question here from our live audience. It says, I watched the FSI Friday session 2 weeks ago on the impact of quantum computing. How does that relate to risk modeling here?
Great question. There's been a lot of questions around quantum computing lately, especially considering the amount of compute power that's needed for risk solutions. So quantum is one of those things that really, it's being used a lot in research and development now. It's not being used a ton in risk, except for where they might be doing some experimentation and working on it. There are some areas that are trying to build that out, but right now, it's something that's going to be up and coming in the future, probably a year or two out before it starts seeing the general use and this type of thing. But it will get there eventually.
Thanks, Brian. We have one other question. Are there any other benefits to focus on besides speed and scale?
Well, so when we start talking about speed and scale, that's one thing. But so getting better control of your data, going through this process, and really being able to manage that data, master that data so that you have standards around it, you don't have data errors, right? This is a very big process. And if you don't have good data going through this, you end up having bad results too. So one of the really important things about building your risk process is having really good data coming into it, because that way your results are going to be much better and much accurate. And even though we talk about big compute and exciting AI and ML, it's really important that as companies are putting this together, they do put the focus on their data quality going through the process.
Brian, we've got another question here from our live audience. It relates to they currently have a lot of this data in their on-premises data centers today, and they're looking to understand kind of, maybe what migration options exist to kind of move that data quickly. But then there's like a two-part question here where they're also looking to understand, what are some of the lessons learned that you can maybe share with your experiences on, how to best take advantage of that data.
Okay, so as to the migration, it really depends on where it is and what format it is in now. But Microsoft has a variety of options to be able to help accelerate that data path to the cloud and really move things forward faster. As far as what would I do different, well, here's the thing. When I started doing this years ago with cloud migration, and now with today's maturity and everything, looking back at how we stepped through and part of that migration, one of the things I would have done differently is probably look to move more to the cloud a lot faster, just because of the ease and the speed that we could have taken advantage of along the way. It really helps you leapfrog your capabilities.
Brian, thanks for sharing that. I think all our customers are, vested, and we want to make sure that we are supporting our customers getting the cloud. But it looks like we ran out of time. So thanks again for watching via YouTube or watching live and asking questions.
If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to FSI notifications and invites by visiting aka.ms/FSI Fridays.
We're also open to constructive feedback, so please send us your comments and suggestions at aka.ms/FSI Fridays feedback.
Be also sure to catch the recordings of our previous sessions on our FSI Fridays YouTube, where you can also post any follow-up questions that weren't covered today.
So don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel.
Thanks, and see you next time
on FSI Fridays.
Thanks, everyone. Give us a call.